Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with a concept that feels, well, it feels fundamental, doesn't it? Universal, almost instinctual, human dignity. But if you actually try to trace when that idea, that feeling, became a formal, enforceable, legal right against the power of the state, suddenly the timeline gets incredibly complicated. The research you provided for this deep dive it's just remarkable. It really forces us to confront this central question. How long has the right to dignity actually been legally enforceable? And maybe more importantly, how is it possible that legal systems separated by vast oceans, huge cultural divides, and, centuries can arrive at the exact same conclusion?
They all land on the same point.
The same point.
Yeah.
This obligation for the state to protect an individual's inherent worth. So our mission today is to trace this universal blueprint of justice, the anti-arbitrary principle. We're going to follow it from its earliest, most potent codified enforcement in judicial history.
And we're talking really early.
Right. And then we'll bring it straight through to modern constitutional law in two radically different countries, the United States and Pakistan. We're going to connect a binding ruling from the 7th century to a landmark Supreme Court decision in 1972, and then to rulings still being handed down today. It's an incredible unifying trajectory. Okay, let's unpack this.
What's so fascinating here, and what the sources really highlight, is that we're not just looking at parallel development. It's not like these two systems grew up side by side. We're looking at convergence.
Yeah.
A convergence on a fundamental truth. The sources let us see this. This legal evolution coming together around one core mandate across history.
And that mandate is?
That the state must prevent degradation and the exercise of arbitrary power. It's that simple and that complex.
Arbitrary power. That seems to be the key phrase.
It is. Because whenever state power becomes arbitrary, especially against people in custody or people subject to the most severe punishments, dignity is always the first casualty, every single time. So, to map this convergence, we've structured this deep dive around three distinct, yet, as you'll see, deeply related pillars.
Okay.
First, we're going to establish the foundational standards of early Islamic governance under Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. You'll often see his name with the honorific R.A., which stands for Radiallahu Anhu. Second, we're going to jump 1,300 years forward.
A small jump.
Just a small one. To analyze the modern American context with the seismic U.S. Supreme Court decision, Furman versus Georgia in 1972.
Right.
And third, we'll look at the explicit, really robust constitutional codification of this right in Pakistan's Article 14 jurisprudence. These 3 points, together, they give us a truly powerful comparative definition of what human justice actually looks like in practice.
And let's begin with the one that is, frankly, the most revolutionary when you consider the global context of its time, the 7th century. This is our Pillar 1, Islamic Judicial Foundation, Umar, R.A., and the concept of karamat al-insan. In the 7th century, across most of what we'd call the civilized world, state power was absolute. The idea of rights for a suspect.
It was non-existent.
Completely non-existent. Coercion was just standard operating procedure for any kind of interrogation. So when you read the historical accounts detailing the prohibitions set down by Caliph Umar, we are talking about a true revolution in criminal justice philosophy.
Really is.
These weren't minor legal tweaks. They were foundational prohibitions laid down right at the birth of the Islamic Empire.
And that historical context is so crucial for understanding why these prohibitions were so radical.
Right.
In the Arabian Peninsula and in the territories around it at the time, criminal procedure was, it was often tribal, or it was based on the immediate arbitrary application of power by whoever was in charge.
The whim of the ruler.
Exactly. Torture and abuse were just assumed rights of the sovereign or the official in power. But then, the sources detail this comprehensive, non-negotiable prohibition list that Umar issued. And it just fundamentally resets the relationship between the state and the individual. He strongly prohibited 5 specific things. And together, these 5 things define what might be the earliest legal standard for dignity.
Okay, what were they?
First, the prohibition of torture during interrogation. Simple, direct.
A huge deal in itself.
A massive deal. Second, the prohibition of beating suspects. And notice the word suspects. Not convicted criminals, but people merely suspected of a crime.
The presumption of innocence is already baked in there.
It is. Third, the forcing of confessions. Fourth, any custodial violence whatsoever. And fifth, and this one is so telling, even mere humiliation by state officials.
Wow. Not just physical harm, but psychological harm.
Precisely. This is the state explicitly acknowledging that the physical integrity and the emotional dignity of a human being, even a suspect, must be protected. That right there is the legal embodiment of karamat al-insan, the inherent nobility and dignity of the human being.
And it's so critical to understand this wasn't just philosophical window dressing, right? This wasn't some high-minded ideal. This was a directive. It immediately affected how the police and judicial administrators, the actual organs of state power, operated across a massive and growing empire. So how did this concept move from a philosophy to, an enforceable legal standard? Was there a specific catalyst, something that forced Umar's hand?
There absolutely was. And this is where the story gets so compelling. The legal texts and the historical accounts all highlight the famous incident of the beaten prisoner.
This was the moment.
This was the catalyst that moved the principle from a concept into binding law. The story goes that Umar learned that a police officer, as some accounts, he's identified as a mutasib, which is sort of an inspector of the markets who also had policing duties, had beaten a prisoner. Why? To try and extract information. A confession. Umar's response was not a private memo. It wasn't a quiet word with the officer. It was a decisive public confrontation that created the foundational legal text on due process and dignity.
So he made an example of it.
A huge example. When he confronted the officer, he issued this stunning rhetorical question, which serves as the legal justification for the entire ruling, what lawyers would call the ratio decidendi. He asked, do you enslave people when their mothers gave birth to them free?
Wait, I want to pause on that quote.
Yeah.
Because it is just so powerful. It instantly connects dignity to the concept of natural, God-given freedom.
It does.
So how did that declaration translate in that moment into law? What was the actual legal consequence for that state officer?
The consequence was immediate, and it was comprehensive. That declaration connects dignity to this idea that freedom is innate, it's something you're born with, and therefore state coercion is always subordinate to that innate worth. The sources emphasize two immediate legal consequences that were enshrined by this one moment. First, this sentence. No punishment is permissible before guilt is established.
There it is.
That single sentence legally establishes the presumption of innocence. And second, and this is just as important, the police officer was publicly punished, he was removed from his post, and the victim of the abuse was financially compensated.
Compensating the victim of state abuse in the 7th century, that changes the entire power dynamic right there. How rare was that globally at the time? I mean, we are talking about centuries before the Magna Carta here.
It was almost unheard of. This single act established a key principle that state officials were held personally liable for custodial misconduct.
Not just the state as an entity.
No, the individual who abused their power. It sends this unmistakable message that power is delegated, not absolute, and is governed by this principle of karamat al-insan. And this one specific incident, this one case, led to an empire-wide command, a foundational legal text for governance. It said, no man shall be struck, imprisoned, or humiliated without due process.
Without due process.
And that command cemented 4 unprecedented legal principles that would go on to define the state's obligation for centuries to come. The presumption of innocence, the absolute prohibition of extracting confessions by force, human dignity as a binding state obligation, and personal liability for state officials. This principle of dignity as a legally enforceable curb on arbitrary power is, well, it's the absolute high watermark for every legal system we are about to examine.
That sets the stage perfectly for Pillar 2. We are now jumping 1,300 years forward, across continents and legal traditions, to the modern American context. We're moving from the foundational Islamic standard of the 7th century to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972 and the landmark case, Furman versus Georgia. And when we make that transition from the 7th century to the 20th, the core legal question remains just hauntingly the same.
It's incredible.
Can the state degrade, humiliate, or arbitrarily take human life? The context for the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, was the application of the death penalty under the 8th Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment.
Right. And the issue that was confronting the Supreme Court in the early 1970s wasn't a sudden surge of, physical torture in prisons in the way we've been discussing. It was a crisis of process, a crisis of fairness in the application of the ultimate state execution.
So it's about the how, not just the what.
Exactly. The research you have details the problems extensively. Before Furman, death penalty statutes were characterized by unguided, unfettered jury discretion. A jury could literally decide who lived or died without any clear standards. No guidance on what to weigh, what was mitigating, what was aggravating.
It was left entirely up to them.
Entirely. And because of this procedural lack, the penalty was being applied unevenly, capriciously. And the data was clear. Minority groups and the poor were disproportionately targeted. The procedures just lacked basic safeguards. And fundamentally, the process itself allowed for bias and really just randomness to determine life or death. The court had to decide if a legal system that allows power to be wielded so randomly is inherently cruel and unusual.
And that concept of arbitrariness, random, unguided state power, that is the precise enduring thread that connects the 7th century to the 20th.
It's the exact same principle.
When Caliph Umar prohibited striking a man without due process, he was attacking procedural arbitrariness. When the Furman court looked at the death penalty, they found that its arbitrary application was what violated the dignity of the condemned. The Furman ruling itself. It resulted in a brief but profound national moratorium on executions. The court held the death penalty unconstitutional. But, and this is the key part, not necessarily because it was always wrong, but unconstitutional as it was then practiced.
A crucial distinction.
And the precise legal reason for this sweeping decision was that the existing practices were declared, and I'm quoting here, arbitrary, capricious, and degrading in violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment.
That finding degrading, that's the judicial nexus between cruelty and dignity. The Supreme Court operates on this principle of evolving standards of decency when it interprets the Eighth Amendment.
Meaning the definition of cruel can change over time.
Exactly. And Justice Brennan and Justice Marshall, in their influential concurring opinions, really drove this home. They argued that for a punishment to be constitutional, it must not violate the inherent dignity of the person. Justice Brennan specifically argued that the death penalty is, in all circumstances, a fatal blow to human dignity because it treats human life as disposable. But even for the majority of the court, the key was the arbitrariness.
The randomness.
The randomness. When the state kills capriciously, it reduces the person to an object of random selection. It strips them of their humanity and their dignity. It's an act of degradation performed by the state itself. This decision was really the first major ruling in modern U.S. constitutional law to explicitly link the right to life, human dignity, and the necessity of a rigorous, non-arbitrary criminal procedure.
So the court was essentially saying that degradation isn't just physical torture. Degradation can be purely procedural.
Yes.
The failure to treat a defendant as a human being worthy of a non-arbitrary application of the law, even if they are guilty, is in itself a violation of their dignity.
It's exactly right. And that directly mirrors Umar's foundational reform. Both systems, separated by more than a millennium, recognize that when the state wields immense power, the power to interrogate, the power to execute, that power has to be strictly governed by non-arbitrary rules.
Otherwise, it's just raw force.
It is.
Yeah.
A legal system that allows power to be exercised based on whim or bias or just procedural failures is inherently a system that degrades the human being.
The sources quote this crucial phrase from the ruling that really cemented this principle. It said, "The dignity of man must not be violated by the instruments of the state." That's the moral injunction, right? The boundary marker for what constitutes legitimate state action.
It is. And so what of Furman is immense because it led to massive, measurable change. To reinstate the death penalty, states had to completely overhaul their statutes.
This wasn't a suggestion.
No, this was a command. They had to introduce things like bifurcated trials, where the guilt phase is separate from the penalty phase. They had to establish clear standards for aggravating and mitigating circumstances. These procedural safeguards were added specifically to eliminate that arbitrary and capricious application that the court had found to be so degrading. The recognition was that the arbitrary infliction of death is degrading not only to the victim, but to the society that allows it. It strips the punishment of its moral authority, and it just turns it into pure state-sanctioned violence.
The state itself has to remain dignified.
The state has to remain dignified in its application of force, or it forfeits its claim to justice. This constitutional moment. It just echoes that profound shift in accountability and due process that was established all the way back in the 7th century.
Okay, so moving from a constitutional principle, that is, you could say implied from the protection against cruelty in the U.S., we now pivot to our third pillar. And this is where dignity is not just inferred, but is explicitly, robustly, and broadly codified as an inviolable fundamental right. We are diving into Pakistan's Article 14 jurisprudence. This constitutional text provides a perfect modern counterpoint because it takes the idea of dignity from being a defensive measure, a shield against cruel punishment, and elevates it into an active, positive fundamental right. Article 14, Section 1 of Pakistan's constitution states, "The dignity of man shall be inviolable."
And that word inviolable is so key. It means it cannot be infringed upon, it can't be damaged, it can't be dishonored. It is placed in the exact same constitutional category as the right to life itself, which is in Article 9.
So it has equal weight.
Equal weight. And for you, the listener, this means it's not just a legal theory or some guidepost. This is a specific enforceable claim that every single citizen can make against the state. This constitutional grounding allows the Supreme Court of Pakistan to take a very aggressive, very expansive stance against any state action that lowers or diminishes a person's inherent worth.
And because that right is so explicitly stated, the courts in Pakistan have been able to issue these precise, powerful rulings that strike directly at arbitrary state power and abuse.
They have. Your research provides a stunning list of specific judicial holdings, and all of them directly echo the principles we saw Umar establish so long ago.
Like what?
Well, torture is unconstitutional. Custodial death is legally defined as murder. And crucially, a forced confession has absolutely no evidentiary value in court. Zero.
So that's the principle of non-coercion, the presumption of innocence, and the prohibition of arbitrary state force all wrapped up into modern constitutional law. But the courts didn't just stop at police procedure, did they? They dramatically expanded what dignity actually means in the context of the state's positive obligation.
Oh, they absolutely did. The rulings established that police brutality is a violation of both Article 9, the right to life, and Article 14, the right to dignity. And critically, the courts affirmed that the state is directly responsible for the safety of people in its custody.
A positive duty to protect.
Yes, and that the right to life includes protection against abuse of power that harms a person's mental and emotional dignity. It's not just about physical harm. This is where the case law deep dive becomes so essential to understanding this.
Okay, let's start with a case that truly demonstrates how far-reaching this interpretation is. Sheila Zia versus Wapide in 1994. How on earth did the Supreme Court connect a polluted environment to a violation of Article 14?
This is a landmark decision, not just for Pakistan, but globally for environmental law. WPDA, which is the Water and Power Development Authority, was planning to construct a big grid station right in the middle of a residential area.
Okay.
The petitioners argued that the electromagnetic fields, the noise pollution, the general environmental degradation from this station would damage the quality of life and the health of the residents. And the court agreed with them.
So what was the legal reasoning there?
It was profound. The court moved from a narrow definition of just physical safety to the quality of life as a core component of dignity. They reasoned that the right to life in Article 9 has to be interpreted broadly. It must include all the necessary requirements for a person to live a healthy, decent, dignified life.
So life isn't just about not being dead.
Exactly. If the environment is so polluted or toxic or hazardous that it prevents a person from living a healthy, full life, then that environment fundamentally violates their human dignity and their right to life. And therefore, the state has an affirmative obligation to ensure a clean, safe environment as a prerequisite for human dignity.
That is a massive conceptual leap. It means the state has to actively ensure conditions that support human worth, not just, refrain from beating someone. It turns dignity into a mandate for social and environmental justice. And then we have the Benazir Bhutto case in 1988, which tackles political freedom and emotional dignity. What was the core violation there?
That case dealt with state-sponsored political harassment and interference. The court ruled that political harassment was a direct violation of dignity. This is so crucial because it links dignity not just to physical safety, but to the freedom to participate in public life without fear of state-sponsored psychological pressure.
Or systematic humiliation.
Or systematic humiliation designed to stifle legitimate political opposition. The court recognized that dignity is destroyed when the state uses its power to demean or intimidate its citizens into silence. This broad interpretation confirms that dignity is synonymous with respect for personal autonomy and freedom from state coercion, whether it's physical or psychological. It establishes a standard where the state cannot use fear or public degradation as a political tool.
And finally, and this is perhaps the most moving application of Article 14, the case law surrounding victims in the judicial process. Specifically, the Salman Akram Raja case regarding rape victim jurisprudence.
This case highlighted the devastating secondary trauma that victims of sexual assault often experience during the investigation and the trial process.
Through the system that's supposed to be helping them.
Exactly. Through insensitive questioning, public exposure, or legal tactics that just felt like re-victimization. The court established that the state must actively protect the dignity of victims throughout the entire trial process. This acknowledgement means the legal process itself, the instruments of the state, must be humane. The courts mandated procedural protections, ensuring that the way evidence is collected, how testimony is taken, and how the victim is treated upholds their fundamental dignity.
So if the state forces a victim to endure a process that strips them of their worth,
Then the state itself is violating Article 14. These rulings all reiterate this core principle that's famously echoed by Pakistani courts, and it links all these expansive applications together. No dignity, no justice.
the clarity and the sheer breadth of Pakistan's constitutional jurisprudence on this it's a real contrast to the implied rights in the U.S. and the executive order nature of the early Islamic reforms. But now we have to bring them all together. It's time for Pillar 5, comparative judicial analysis and universal truth. We've tracked this one concept, this boundary on state power, from a 7th century executive order through a 20th century judicial interpretation of the U.S. Constitution to a 21st century fundamental right that's enshrined in Asian constitutional law. The parallels are absolutely stunning, especially when we break down the common elements.
Let's synthesize these findings using the structure your research provides. The most enduring parallel is the prohibition of arbitrary physical and psychological degradation.
The core idea.
It's the core. In the 7th century, Umar bans humiliation and physical abuse. In the 20th century, Furman prohibits arbitrary punishment that is inherently degrading. And Article 14 in Pakistan explicitly declares custodial torture illegal and inviolable, and then extends that to environmental and political degradation.
So all three systems identified that degrading the physical or psychological existence of an individual is the very first assault on justice.
It is. And the second key convergence centers on the use of coercion and arbitrary power within the criminal procedure itself. It's about securing the integrity of the process of finding the truth.
How so?
Well, forced confessions were forbidden in early Islamic governance, which immediately reinforced the presumption of innocence and, limited the incentive for police abuse.
Right.
In the U.S., the Furman court found the arbitrary death penalty unconstitutional, precisely because the lack of standards allowed for procedural degradation. And in Pakistan, a forced confession has zero evidentiary value. It just shuts the door on coerced testimony and makes police brutality completely counterproductive.
So the integrity of the truth-finding process is seen as being inextricably linked to human dignity.
It has to be.
Yeah.
You cannot have reliable justice if the source of your evidence is coercion.
And finally, the mechanism of enforcement. Accountability. This is where the law becomes real for the state official on the ground.
Absolutely. In Umar's governance, officials were held personally accountable for misconduct. They had to compensate the victim, a profound check on power.
Right.
In the U.S., the state was forced, through judicial review, to ensure a humane and non-arbitrary criminal process that's a structural check on power. And in Pakistan, police are held liable for abuse under the strength of Article 14, with these incredibly expansive definitions of what constitutes abuse.
So in every case, the law is not just some theoretical boundary. It is an active mechanism for holding the wielders of state power to account for violating the human dignity of the individual.
And that leads us to the ultimate conclusion. The ratio decidendi derived from this entire tri-century comparative tradition. The right to life is inseparable from the right to dignity. A state that violates dignity violates justice itself.
It's that direct.
It's that direct. This universal truth is a core insight for you, the listener. The historical trajectory shows that regardless of the legal framework, whether it's religious, common law, or modern constitutional, the core protective impulse against arbitrary state action is identical. Islam set the earliest anti-torture standards for state administration. U.S. jurisprudence in the 20th century used the dignity doctrine to redefine what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, tightening the constraints on capital power. Yeah. And Pakistan constitutionalized dignity as an inviolable fundamental right, and then actively expanded its application into environmental safety and political freedom.
What stands out to me is just the sheer continuity of the challenge. The legal language is different. You have Karamat al-Insan, the 8th Amendment, Article 14, but the essential protective impulse is identical.
It is.
It's an acknowledgement that certain inherent qualities of the human person just transcend governmental authority. It is a limitation imposed on the sovereign by the very nature of humanity. The final, powerful, universal truth established by all these sources is this. Justice begins with how a society treats its weakest persons, prisoners, suspects, and the powerless.
That's the test.
These are the people who stand alone before the machinery of the state, and their treatment is the ultimate barometer of a society's commitment to law. If you can protect the dignity of the person accused of a heinous crime, then you have a just system.
Absolutely. The measure of a civilization isn't found in its declarations of power or the might of its institutions. It's found in the limits it places on that power. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of the individual, even the one accused of the most heinous crime, and ensuring that the state never, ever becomes a source of degradation.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm genuinely struck by the resilience of this principle. That a command articulated by a caliph in the 7th century remains the central constitutional challenge for modern legal systems, grappling with policing, criminal justice, environmental health, political participation.
All of it.
This is not just history, it is the active, evolving definition of justice itself.
And that leads us to the definitive moral lesson from these sources. A civilization is measured not by the size of its GDP or the strength of its army, but by the dignity it protects, especially for those who stand alone before state power. The ultimate test of any system of government is how it treats the people it holds captive, because that is where the state's power is most absolute, and thus where its potential for arbitrary degradation is highest.
A profound thought to end on. We've established that human dignity is this ancient, universal, and absolutely inviolable right that has to be defended against arbitrary state action, whether that action is physical abuse, unfair procedure, or environmental negligence. But the nature of state power is constantly evolving. As we move further into the 21st century, and given the deep historical and constitutional roots we've explored, roots that mandate protection against physical force, humiliation, and procedural capriciousness, we have to consider how these principles apply to new threats. So what are the modern technological challenges? Things like pervasive digital surveillance, AI-driven predictive policing, or the control and use of our personal data. Do these things require a new, robust constitutional defense of human dignity in the coming decades?
A fascinating question.
The sources show that dignity is violated when the individual is reduced to an object of state control, when the state can see everything, process everything, and predict behavior. Does that, too, constitute a form of structural, arbitrary degradation that demands a new constitutional response? That's what you have to consider as you reflect on this journey.